The steam rose from my bathwater like prayers I'd stopped believing in, but that October night in 1954, I still thought our house on Maple Ridge Road held some fragment of sanctuary. I was 22 years old, freshly graduated from Penn State, with a teaching degree that felt worthless in my hands, trapped back home while the Korean War raged overseas and took away what few opportunities existed for young women in our dying Pennsylvania mill town. I should have heard the footsteps creaking on the old floorboards above. Should have noticed how the house had grown too quiet after dinner, when normally I could hear Father's radio playing war news and Tommy practicing his sales pitch for tomorrow's customers. But the cast iron tub had been my refuge since childhood, the one place where I could lock out the world and pretend safety still existed. The bathroom door had a broken latch that never quite held swelling with humidity until it required force to stay closed. That's why I didn't think anything of it when the door creaked open. Old houses make noise, especially ours, built in 1897, when craftsmanship meant durability, but modern conveniences were still dreams. The frosted window rattled as the evening freight train rumbled past, carrying coal to defense plants in Pittsburgh. When I opened my eyes, my brother Tommy stood in the doorway, wearing his traveling salesman's smile, the one that had charmed hundreds of housewives into buying brushes they didn't need. Behind him, swaying with the particular looseness that came after his fourth whiskey, stood our father. The smell of alcohol cut through the steam like acid sharp and wrong. "Don't mind us, Ruthie," Tommy said, his voice carrying that practiced charm he used on difficult customers. "Just thought our college girl might want some family company." Time fractured. The water that had felt comforting moments before suddenly seemed scalding, then freezing. I reached for the towel hanging just beyond my fingertips, but Tommy stepped into the bathroom and Father followed, and the door swung shut with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. What happened next lasted 15 minutes in real time, but stretched into geological ages in my memory. They violated me in that steaming bathroom while the freight train's whistle covered my screams, their hands destroying not just my body, but every assumption I'd ever held about family safety and home. When it was over, they left me in the cooling water like evidence of a crime they were already forgetting. Tommy straightened his tie with the same motion he used before approaching a customer's door. Father tucked in his shirt and muttered something about keeping family business in the family. I stayed in that tub for 2 hours watching my reflection in the darkening water. The girl who'd climbed into that bath was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, infinitely more alone. But in that terrible moment of recognition, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to destroy them both slowly and completely, using their own weapons against them. They'd taught me that survival required deception. I was about to show them how much I'd learned. My name is Ruth Connolly, though by the end of this story, you'll understand why that name feels borrowed. In the autumn of 1954, I was caught between worlds, a college-educated woman in a town that barely tolerated such notions, trapped in a house where modern ideas were considered dangerous foolishness. Cedar Falls, Pennsylvania had been slowly dying since the mines started closing. Our house on Maple Ridge Road stood like a monument to better times, built by my great-grandfather, when Irish immigrants could still dream of prosperity through backbreaking labor. 3 generations of Connollys had lived and died within those walls, leaving behind layers of memory that felt increasingly heavy as the years passed. Father Patrick Connolly worked sporadically at Morrison's lumber mill when his hands weren't shaking too badly from the previous night's drinking. The Korean War had initially boosted business, but Father's reliability had deteriorated along with his liver. At 51, he looked 70, his immigrant dreams long since pickled in whiskey and disappointment. But I remembered him differently once. The man who'd taught me to read using his treasured copy of Great Expectations, who'd carved me a wooden doll when store-bought toys were beyond our means, who'd cried genuine tears at Mother's funeral. That version of Patrick Connolly still surfaced occasionally, usually when he was sober enough to remember what kindness felt like. "You're too smart for your own good," Ruthie he'd said just weeks before, watching me unpack my college things with something approaching pride. "Your mother always said you were special, different from the rest of us." Different. Even then, that word had felt loaded with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. Tommy was 4 years older and possessed the kind of charm that could sell ice to Eskimos, as Mother used to say. He worked for Fuller Brush Company, traveling through small towns with a trunk full of cleaning supplies and a briefcase full of practiced compliments. Where Father had given up fighting the world, Tommy engaged with it daily, winning small victories through silver-tongued persuasion. "The secret to sales," he'd explained during one of his practice sessions in our kitchen, "is making each customer feel like the most important person you've ever met. You listen to their problems, you sympathize with their struggles, you make them believe buying your product is just an excuse to spend time with them." Tommy had been my champion throughout childhood, the big brother who taught me card tricks and defended me from schoolyard bullies who'd driven me to the train station when I left for college with $20 pressed into my hand and instructions to make the family proud college girl. But something had shifted during my final semester. His letters became shorter, more probing about my social life, asking pointed questions about the boys I was dating. When I'd written about my engagement to Robert Chen, a Chinese-American engineering student whose intelligence and kindness had captured my heart, Tommy's response had been swift and harsh. "What would Mother think about you running around with Orientals?" he'd written. "Come home before you embarrass the family name permanently." Robert had died in a construction accident 2 weeks later, crushed by a crane that collapsed while he was walking to class. The tragedy shattered my world and sent me home to Cedar Falls with no plans beyond surviving each day. Tommy met me at the train station with flowers and condolences, but I'd caught him watching me with an expression I couldn't identify, something between satisfaction and anticipation that made my skin crawl. Our mother, Sarah Margaret O'Brien Connolly, had been the heart of our family until pneumonia claimed her during the harsh winter of 1951. She'd worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and alterations to supplement Father's irregular income, her fingers flying over fabric with the skill of someone who'd learned that necessity was the mother of invention. Mother had possessed an inner strength that sustained us through every crisis. But she'd also carried secrets that became clearer only after her death. I'd found her diary while packing her belongings, a small leather-bound book hidden beneath her sewing supplies, filled with observations that seemed mundane until viewed through the lens of what came later. "Ruth is such a blessing," she'd written in 1947. "God's way of bringing light into a house that had grown too dark. Patrick loves her dearly, though sometimes I wonder if he sees her as I do, not just as his daughter, but as something precious that was entrusted to our care." Entrusted to our care. Another phrase that felt weighted with hidden meaning. The house itself reflected our family's gradual decline. The front porch sagged on the left side where the foundation had settled unevenly. The kitchen stove required constant adjustment, and the icebox leaked persistently despite my daily mopping. The bathroom was particularly problematic. The door latch had been broken for months, the window no longer sealed properly, and the overhead bulb flickered intermittently, casting uncertain shadows across white tile walls. But good memories were woven through the decay like gold thread in worn fabric. Sunday dinners, when we'd crowd around the kitchen table, and Tommy would regale us with stories about his customers, the widow in Johnstown, who collected ceramic elephants, the young mother in Altoona, who baked him cookies every month, the elderly couple in State College who'd shown him photographs from their 1903 honeymoon. People are lonelier than they let on. Tommy had observed during one such dinner, his voice carrying unusual sincerity. Especially women whose husbands are overseas or working long shifts at defense plants. Sometimes they buy my brushes just to have someone listen to them for half an hour. Father had nodded approvingly, raising his glass in a rare toast. "Understanding what people really want, that's good business sense, son." Those moments had felt genuine, substantial, which made what happened later all the more devastating. I'd believed in the goodness of those memories, trusted in the safety that blood relationships were supposed to provide. That trust nearly cost me everything. The morning after they destroyed me in that bathroom, I woke to find my bedroom door unlocked, but my purse missing, my college diploma removed from its frame, my few pieces of jewelry relocated to Father's dresser drawer for safekeeping. They were taking control, systematically using psychological pressure with the expertise of experienced jailers. Tommy brought me coffee in bed, perching on my desk chair with that salesman's confidence, dressed for work in his best gray suit. "You look tired, sis. Rough night." His smile was all teeth and false warmth. Sometimes, when we're under stress, we remember things differently than they actually happened. The mind plays tricks, you know. I forced myself to meet his eyes, fighting every instinct to hide beneath the blankets. "I remember everything perfectly." "Do you? Because Father and I remember helping you get cleaned up after you'd had too much wine with dinner. You were pretty upset about something, crying, carrying on about imaginary problems. We were just trying to calm you down." The lie was delivered with such casual confidence that for a moment I almost doubted my own memories. But the soreness between my legs was real. The bruises on my wrists were real, and the taste of violation in my mouth was unmistakably genuine. Father was more direct when Tommy left for his sales route, cornering me in the kitchen while I forced down breakfast I couldn't taste. "Listen careful, girl," he growled, his breath still reeking of last night's whiskey. "You start telling wild stories about this family, and I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of girl you really are. College must have filled your head with loose ideas about proper behavior." "I haven't told anyone anything," I whispered. "Good, because in a town this small, a girl's reputation is all she's got. Lose that, and you might as well pack up and leave permanently." His hand closed around my wrist with casual violence. "We understand each other?" I nodded, playing the compliant victim while my mind raced through possibilities. They'd removed the telephone from my bedroom and positioned the main house phone in the front hallway, where every conversation could be monitored. My car keys had vanished, along with any money I might have used for transportation. Even my writing materials had been confiscated under the pretense of helping me rest. But desperation made me thorough in ways I'd never been before. I began searching Mother's bedroom untouched, since her death preserved like a shrine to grief. Behind her jewelry box taped to the underside of the drawer, with medical tape yellowed by age, I found a small envelope containing $47 and a note in Mother's careful handwriting. "Emergency money, darling. Sometimes a woman needs to run." The real treasure was hidden more cleverly. Moving the jewelry box revealed a gap between floorboards where someone had concealed a small black diary and what appeared to be an old Motorola two-way radio, the kind traveling salesmen used for business communication. Mother's diary revealed patterns of violence I'd been too young to recognize. References to Father's bad days and Tommy's helpful nature took on sinister meanings when viewed through the lens of my recent experience. "Patrick struck me again tonight," read one entry from 1947. "Claims I spoke too freely with Reverend Matthews about women's activities. Says wives should know their place. The bruise will fade, but the pattern grows clearer." Another entry from 1949. "Tommy watches Ruth in ways that disturb me. When she helps with laundry, he finds excuses to walk through. When she practices piano, he lingers in doorways. I've spoken to Patrick about boundaries, but he says, I'm imagining problems. The radio was dead, but its battery compartment held another note. Replacement batteries in sewing box, behind blue thread. Emergency use only." My hands trembled as I installed fresh batteries, watching the screen flicker to life. One bar of signal, but enough to access the regional emergency network connecting rural areas with county authorities. Mother had prepared for this possibility, understanding that her death wouldn't end the cycle of violence, but redirect it toward her daughter. That realization nearly broke me, but it also filled me with purpose that burned clean and bright. I spent that day playing the perfect victim, apologizing for misunderstanding the previous night, accepting their version where stress and confusion had led me to imagine impossible things. But that night, while they slept, I began building my case with methodical precision. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence, it was maintaining the performance, while my entire being screamed for escape. Every smile at breakfast felt like swallowing glass, every casual conversation required enormous self-control. But I forced myself to be patient, to play their game while constructing my own strategy. They'd taught me that survival required deception. I was about to apply that lesson more effectively than they'd ever imagined. Over the following weeks, I transformed into something resembling a detective, using Tommy's sales schedule and Father's mill shifts to create windows of opportunity for my real work. The hidden radio became my lifeline to resources I'd never known existed, connecting me with women's crisis centers and legal advocates who understood the precarious nature of my situation. "Document everything," advised a volunteer named Margaret, whose voice carried the authority of experience. "Photographs, written records, witness statements if possible. But trust your instincts about when to run. No evidence is worth your life." I created multiple copies of everything, hiding them throughout the house, one set behind Mother's jewelry box, another beneath a loose floorboard in my closet, a third in the old root cellar accessed through the basement. If they discovered one cache, others might survive. But evidence gathering was only part of my strategy. I needed to understand their psychology to predict their reactions and plan accordingly. This required conversations that walked the razor's edge between appearing normal and gathering crucial information. "Tommy," I said one evening while he counted sales commissions at the kitchen table, "do you ever worry about customers making false accusations? Your word against theirs." He looked up with that practiced smile, though I caught a flicker of wariness. "What kind of accusations would they make, sis?" "Oh, nothing specific. Just wondered how you'd handle it if someone claimed you'd been inappropriate or stolen something." "Reputation matters in sales," he said, relaxing as he interpreted my question as innocent curiosity. "People buy from people they trust. That's why family reputation is so important. We all protect each other's standing in the community." These conversations provided insight while serving as test runs for recordings I planned to make. I learned to ask leading questions that encouraged them to elaborate on their philosophies about family loyalty and women's proper roles. Father proved more challenging to manipulate through conversation, but alcohol loosened his tongue predictably. During evening drinking sessions, I began joining him in the living room, ostensibly to listen to radio programs, but actually to guide his increasingly slurred commentary. "Problem with women today is they don't know their place," he declared one night during heavy drinking. "War's got everything, backward women in factories making decisions thinking they're equal. Surely some women are capable of important work." I suggested carefully knitting to keep my hands busy while the hidden radio recorded our conversation. "Capable maybe, but that's not the point. Point is knowing your role in the natural order. When women get ideas above their station, somebody has to remind them where they belong." "How do you remind them?" "Same way you train a stubborn horse. Firm hand, consistent discipline, no tolerance for rebellion. Most learn quick enough if the lesson's clear." These recorded conversations provided evidence of their mindset, but they also revealed the depth of their conviction that violence was justified, even necessary. They weren't acting from temporary insanity. They were implementing a carefully considered philosophy that made them genuinely dangerous. The breakthrough came during my third week of investigation when I overheard a telephone conversation that changed everything. Tommy was speaking to someone I couldn't identify, but his tone suggested familiarity and shared understanding. "She's settling down nicely," he said with satisfaction. "Little rougher initially than expected, but she's learning her place. Father was right about direct approach being more effective than gradual persuasion." Pause while he listened, then laughter that chilled my blood. "Oh, she won't be going anywhere soon. We made sure she understands consequences of telling tales. Besides, where would she go? No money, no transportation, no one who'd believe her word over ours." Another pause, longer this time. "The cousin situation worked out fine eventually. Took time to find the right spot, but she won't cause problems anymore. Ruth's got better sense than Sarah did, understands family loyalty goes both ways." My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the radio. Tommy was discussing Sarah Connolly, my cousin, who disappeared 3 years earlier. The family claimed she'd run off with some drifter, but now I understood the truth. They'd killed her, and they were planning the same fate for me. That night, I made copies of every recording and photograph, creating comprehensive packages of evidence. I wrote detailed letters to police, the district attorney, and women's crisis centers, explaining everything I'd discovered and providing specific instructions for finding Sarah's remains if something happened to me. But simply sending evidence might not be enough. If they discovered my activities before authorities could act, they'd kill me exactly as they had Sarah. I needed a more immediate plan, one that would force a confrontation on terms I could control. The answer came as I listened to their snores through the house's thin walls. I was going to make them confess everything on recording, then escape, with evidence so compelling that no jury would doubt their guilt. It was dangerous, but survival sometimes required risking everything on a single desperate gamble. The truth revealed itself through something as mundane as organizing Mother's sewing supplies, which made its horror more devastating. I was searching for additional hiding places when I discovered a trunk behind the basement furnace covered by a tarpaulin that hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth like precious artifacts, were items belonging to Sarah Connolly, her silver locket college class ring, the blue dress she'd worn the last time I saw her alive. More damning were dozens of photographs showing Sarah in various states of undress and distress, clearly taken without consent, throughout our house. My hands trembled as I examined evidence of systematic predation. These weren't random snapshots, but carefully composed images suggesting planning and forethought. Sarah had been documented like a specimen, her violation preserved as trophy collection. But the most devastating discovery was a leather journal in Tommy's handwriting detailing what he called family education sessions with clinical precision. Entries began 3 months before Sarah's disappearance, describing gradual psychological manipulation designed to break her resistance. Day 12. Subject resists direct approaches, but shows compliance signs when isolated from external support. Father suggests increasing pressure through economic dependency. Day 23. Photographic documentation effective for maintaining cooperation. Subject understands consequences of reporting family business to authorities. Day 35. Final lesson administered successfully. Subject now compliant with family expectations. Disposal arrangements finalized when usefulness expires. The clinical language made me physically ill, but I forced myself to read every entry. This journal provided proof of premeditation that would prevent any claims of temporary insanity. But the journal contained one more revelation that shattered my understanding of family identity. The final entry, dated after Sarah's disappearance, contained information that changed everything. Cleanup successful. Evidence eliminated. Official story accepted. Note for future non-biological family members often more resistant to discipline than blood relatives, possibly due to reduced loyalty factors. Next selection should prioritize genetic connections for enhanced compliance. Non-biological. I read those words 3 times before their implications registered. I wasn't Patrick Connolly's daughter by birth, wasn't genetically connected to these monsters. The revelation should have been liberating, but instead, it opened new depths of horror as I realized the calculated nature of my selection as their victim. I climbed the basement stairs, clutching the journal, made my way to Mother's bedroom, and retrieved her diary to read with new understanding. The truth was scattered through years of carefully coded entries. Brought Ruth home today. Read the first relevant entry dated October 15, 1932. Poor little thing, barely 2 years old, wandering alone after that terrible train accident outside Harrisburg. No family claimed her state orphanage overcrowded. Patrick agreed she could stay temporarily, but I see him growing attached. Perhaps God meant us to have a daughter. Subsequent entries revealed that my adoption had been informal, accomplished through paperwork manipulation rather than official channels. Patrick had used connections at the county courthouse where his brother worked as clerk to create documents establishing my identity as Ruth Connolly. Patrick loves her like she was born to us, Mother had written in 1940. But I worry about Tommy's attitude. He's always been jealous of attention, and now that Ruth is growing older, prettier, I see him watching in ways that disturb me. I've tried speaking to Patrick about boundaries, but he says I'm imagining problems. The diary confirmed my suspicions about household violence patterns, while revealing Mother's desperate attempts to protect me from a fate she anticipated with terrifying clarity. I've hidden resources where Ruth can find them if needed. She'd written shortly before her death. I pray she'll never need them, but I've seen what Patrick and Tommy are capable of. If I'm not here to shield her, she'll need every advantage I can provide. The final entry, dated days before her fatal illness, contained instructions proving she'd foreseen exactly what would happen. Told Ruth about emergency preparations disguised as wartime reminiscences. She's intelligent enough to remember when needed. Evidence about Patrick and Tommy's violence is hidden with the radio enough to protect her if she's clever about using it. I pray I'm wrong about what they'll do once I'm gone, but I've prepared for the worst. I sat surrounded by evidence of systematic predation, spanning decades, understanding that I wasn't fighting isolated violence, but an established pattern that would continue until someone stopped it permanently. Sarah had been their first recorded victim, but probably not their first actual victim. I wouldn't be their last unless I ended their cycle completely. My adoption explained their confidence in assaulting me. They knew I had no extended family to investigate my disappearance, no blood relatives who might ask uncomfortable questions. They'd selected me with the same calculating precision Tommy used, identifying vulnerable customers. But their calculation contained a fatal flaw. They'd assumed biological connection was necessary for family loyalty, that adopted children were inherently less trustworthy. They'd underestimated bonds forged through shared experience, and more importantly, they'd underestimated the intelligence and determination of their chosen victim. I wasn't Ruth Connolly, daughter of monsters. I was someone else entirely. Someone with no genetic connection to their evil. Someone free to destroy them without destroying herself. That understanding filled me with purpose that burned cleaner and brighter than rage. They'd forced me to become their enemy. Now I was going to show them exactly how dangerous an enemy could be when she had nothing left to lose. My carefully maintained facade cracked on a Thursday morning when Tommy's schedule betrayed him. He'd claimed to be visiting Lancaster County customers, but I'd seen his car behind Murphy's Tavern the previous evening. He'd returned early and caught me photographing journal pages with the radio's camera function. Well, well. His voice cut through basement air like a blade. What do we have here, little sister? I spun around, clutching the journal heart, hammering so violently I was certain he could hear it echoing off concrete walls. Tommy stood at the stairway bottom, blocking my only exit. His salesman's smile stretched wide, but failing to reach his eyes. Just cleaning Mother's things? I said, voice barely steady. Including my private papers. He stepped closer, hand extended, like he was coaxing a frightened animal. Come on, Ruth. Hand over whatever you've taken, and we can discuss this civilly. Instead of compliance, I bolted toward the root cellar exit, but Tommy was faster than anticipated. His salesman's reflexes, honed by years chasing reluctant customers, allowed him to intercept me before I'd covered half the distance. His fingers closed around my wrist with bruising force bones grinding together as he twisted my arm behind my back with practiced efficiency. The journal scattered across concrete floor like evidence of foolish overconfidence. You've been spying on us, he said, voice carrying genuine hurt alongside anger. Recording private conversations, stealing documents, planning God knows what betrayal. He retrieved the radio while maintaining his grip, scrolling through recorded files. When he reached conversations about Sarah's murder, his face went through surprised calculation, then something approaching professional respect. You clever little bitch. He breathed tone, suggesting admiration for well-executed deception. playing us for weeks, making us think you'd accepted your place when you were building a case. The radio displayed dozens of recordings, photographs, detailed notes. Tommy studied this documentation with focused attention, usually reserved for sales statistics calculating damage I'd potentially caused to their facade. "Patrick!" he shouted, upward voice echoing like summons to judgment. "Get down here, serious problem." Father appeared within moments, still wearing mill clothes, face set in defensive scowl. When he saw me captive, saw scattered evidence, his expression shifted to genuine panic. "How much?" he asked without preamble. "Everything," Tommy replied, holding up the radio like prosecutor's evidence. "The assault, Sarah, private conversations, all of it. She's been documenting our activities for weeks." Father's face went gray, aging 10 years in seconds. The confident man who'd intimidated me into silence was suddenly revealed as someone who'd built his existence on assumptions that crimes would never be discovered. "Can't let her leave," Tommy continued with businessman's certainty. "Can't let her talk to anyone until we figure out what to do." "Coal cellar," Father said quietly, "like before." The words confirmed my worst suspicions about Sarah's final days. They'd imprisoned her in that dark, airless space while deciding her fate, planning identical treatment for me. They dragged me toward the basement corner, where a narrow door led to coal storage, a cramped space barely large enough for standing. I'd explored it during childhood hide-and-seek, but now it represented prison, where they could keep me isolated while planning permanent disappearance. "Please," I begged, abandoning dignity and strategy. "I'll delete everything. I'll never tell anyone. I swear on Mother's grave, I'll stay quiet." But their faces remained impassive, businesslike. They'd moved beyond anger into cold damage control, treating me like problematic account needing termination rather than human being deserving mercy. They bound my hands with expert efficiency movements, coordinated in ways suggesting previous experience. Then they locked me in that horrible space, windowless, filled with decades of coal dust that made breathing difficult while they planned my murder upstairs. Through thin ceiling, I heard voices discussing logistics with casual efficiency. Body disposal without attracting attention, explaining my disappearance to neighbors, cleaning evidence linking them to my death. But their confidence in the cellar's security proved their fatal mistake. During childhood games, I'd discovered a crawl space connecting coal storage to the root cellar passage, barely wide enough for a child, but navigable for a desperate adult. The opening was hidden behind rotted lumber they'd forgotten existed. It took 3 hours to work through debris with bound hands, fighting claustrophobia and panic with every inch. But desperation gave me strength I hadn't known I possessed. I emerged in the root cellar with scraped knees, bleeding palms, lungs full of dust. The exterior door was rusted but not locked, and I forced it open using concrete block as lever. Outside, evening darkness had fallen across Pennsylvania countryside. I could see kitchen light where they continued planning, probably assuming I remained securely imprisoned. I had no transportation, no money, only 4 miles of rural roads to town. But I had absolute certainty they'd kill me if I didn't reach safety. And that knowledge gave me strength to run faster than I'd ever imagined possible. Mrs. Henderson's farm sat half a mile down County Road 15, my only hope for immediate help. I ran through corn stubble and frozen mud, while behind me shouting erupted from our house as they discovered my escape, followed by engine sounds as they began pursuit. The game had become deadly serious, and time was running out to prove victim could become victor through intelligence, determination, and willingness to risk everything for justice. Mrs. Henderson answered my frantic pounding with a shotgun, and suspicion carved in weathered features, reasonable precaution for a 73-year-old widow during an era when rural crime was increasing. But seeing my condition, torn clothes, bleeding hands, terror written across my face, her expression shifted from wariness to maternal fury. "Sweet Jesus, child, what happened?" I collapsed against her doorframe, gasping after the desperate run through muddy fields. Words poured out in rushing torrents, the assault, Sarah's murder evidence I'd gathered, systematic predation hidden behind respectable facade for years. Mrs. Henderson listened with focused attention of someone who'd survived depression and 2 wars understanding that evil could wear familiar faces. Her shotgun grip never wavered, but her free hand reached out to steady me. "We're calling police," she declared. "Right now." But the telephone line was dead. Whether from infrastructure failure or sabotage, we couldn't know. The silence felt like death sentence. Mrs. Henderson cursed impressively, then made a decision that saved both our lives. "Get in the truck. We're driving to town, not stopping for anything." Her ancient Ford started on the 3rd tri-engine, coughing, before settling into steady rumble. We'd traveled perhaps 2 miles when headlights appeared behind us, approaching with relentless pursuit speed. "Hold on, child," Mrs. Henderson muttered, pressing accelerator to floor and coaxing maximum speed from aging engine. "Those boys picked the wrong woman tonight." But Tommy's newer car was faster, and he knew these roads better than anyone. At the intersection of County Road 15 and State Route 30, only junction between Mrs. Henderson's farm and Cedar Falls. Tommy's headlights appeared directly ahead, blocking our path with calculated precision. He climbed out, wearing his best suit, hands raised peacefully. Salesman's smile bright enough to illuminate the intersection. To casual observers, he'd appear to be concerned family member, helping with unfortunate misunderstanding. "Ruth," he called through Mrs. Henderson's window voice, carrying perfect brotherly concern. "Thank God you're safe. We've been looking everywhere. Father and I were worried sick finding your room empty." Mrs. Henderson wasn't buying his performance for a second. Her shotgun came up with smooth efficiency of lifelong hunter trained to recognize predators regardless of convincing disguises. "Stay where you are, Thomas Connolly," she commanded with absolute authority. "I've heard this girl's story. I know exactly what kind of man you really are." Tommy's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his posture, subtle tension suggesting salesman calculating whether charm or force would be more effective. Behind him, Father emerged from passenger side, moving with heavy deliberation of someone accustomed to violence as problem-solving tool. "Mrs. Henderson," Tommy said with practiced reasonableness, "I think there's been misunderstanding. Ruth has been under tremendous stress since returning from college." The shotgun blast lit the intersection like lightning report echoing across empty farmland and sending both men diving for cover. Mrs. Henderson had fired as warning, but the message was unmistakably clear. "Next one goes center mass," she announced calmly, working the action with practiced efficiency. "Run, child, get to town and find Sheriff Morrison." I ran toward distant Cedar Falls lights like salvation depended on it because it did. Behind me, I heard more shouting, another gunshot, then terrible engine sound as they abandoned recapture attempts to focus on eliminating the witness. 2 miles to town stretched like impossible distance. But terror gave my legs strength I hadn't known I possessed. I reached Main Street as Tommy's car crested the hill behind me, headlights sweeping pavement like searchlight beams hunting escaped prisoners. Cedar Falls Police Station occupied a small brick building next to volunteer fire department. I burst through doors screaming for help before Sergeant Morrison could look up from evening paperwork. What followed was controlled chaos as competing narratives collided in that lobby. Tommy composed and persuasive explained his sister had suffered nervous breakdown and was making wild accusations. Father supported his story about family members trying to help troubled young woman who'd lost touch with reality. But Sergeant Morrison was veteran cop with 30 years' experience reading people. He recognized difference between calculated lies and genuine terror. More importantly, he'd known our family for decades and harbored private suspicions about incidents that never made official reports. Miss Connolly," he said quietly, ignoring Tommy's protests about family privacy. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened from beginning. Take your time. We've got all night." The medical examination provided physical evidence supporting my accusations, healing bruises consistent with forcible restraint, internal injuries consistent with sexual assault rope burns, corroborating imprisonment accounts. But most damning evidence came from recordings and journal I'd hidden in root cellar before escape. When search warrant was executed the following morning, investigators found not only evidence I'd documented, but also Sarah Connolly's remains buried beneath coal cellar floor, along with additional journals detailing years of systematic violence against multiple victims. The trial became biggest news story in Cedar Falls history, drawing reporters from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia who transformed our quiet courthouse into media circus. I testified for 8 hours across 3 days, while Tommy and father sat at defense table like mourners at their own funeral. Their lawyer tried portraying me as disturbed young woman seeking attention through false accusations, but physical evidence was overwhelming. Recorded confessions, photographic documentation, medical reports, and ultimately Sarah's remains created case so compelling that jury deliberated less than 2 hours. Tommy received life without parole for rape kidnapping and first-degree murder. Father got 25 to life as accomplice his age, and alcoholism the only factors saving him from electric chair. But real victory came in aftermath, when additional victims came forward with stories spanning decades, women from neighboring towns who'd suffered similar attacks during Tommy's sales routes, local residents who'd suspected but never reported domestic violence, relatives of other missing persons who'd vanished under circumstances remarkably similar to Sarah's disappearance. The conviction wasn't just justice for Sarah and myself, it was the end of predatory operation that had been destroying lives while hiding behind small-town respectability facade. The months following trial passed in blur of legal proceedings, media interviews, and strange adjustment to living without constant fear. I moved to Philadelphia, drawn by anonymity of large city where my story hadn't dominated headlines for weeks. I found temporary lodging in boarding house run by kindly German immigrant named Mrs. Kaufman, who asked no questions about my past. The insurance settlement combined with mother's small life insurance policy held in probate provided enough resources to consider options carefully rather than accepting first available opportunity. I could have used my teaching degree, found work in city schools, but standing before classrooms felt overwhelming when my own education had been so violently interrupted. Instead, I found myself drawn to nursing profession that would allow helping people during vulnerable moments while providing immediately useful skills. The application process for Philadelphia General Hospital's nursing program required extensive background checks. I was initially concerned that recent notoriety might disqualify me, but program director Margaret Hartley, who'd served as Army nurse during World War II, took different view. "You've seen the worst humans can do to each other," she said during my interview, "and survived with compassion intact? That's exactly the perspective we need in this profession." Coursework came easily. Anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, patient care procedures, requiring memorization and practical application. But more important were interpersonal skills I developed working with trauma patients. I learned recognizing subtle domestic violence signs, asking right questions without creating additional danger, providing resource information without appearing to judge. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, psychiatrist appointed by court to evaluate my mental state during proceedings, continued our therapeutic relationship long after professionally required. She helped me understand that recovery wasn't destination, but process rebuilding identity existing independently from violence that had temporarily defined it. "You're not just survivor," she explained during one session. "You're someone who chose fighting back, who refused letting evil pass unchallenged, who transformed personal tragedy into public justice. That transformation doesn't erase what happened, but gives it meaning beyond suffering." Media attention, initially overwhelming and intrusive, gradually provided unexpected connections with other survivors nationwide. I received dozens of letters from women who'd experienced similar assaults, many expressing gratitude that someone had finally spoken publicly about family violence. Several became lifelong correspondents, creating informal mutual support network invaluable during difficult healing phases. But perhaps most meaningful correspondence came from Detective Raymond Chen of Philadelphia Police Department. He'd tracked me down through newspaper coverage, wanting to meet the woman whose story had inspired his own work in domestic violence unit. "Cases like yours help us understand perpetrator patterns," he explained during our first meeting at Cafe near Independence Hall. "They isolate victims, undermine confidence, create financial dependence, use shame as weapon to prevent reporting." But they also share vulnerabilities, arrogance, overconfidence in manipulation, ability, tendency to document crimes as trophies. Our friendship developed slowly, built on shared commitment to justice and mutual respect for each other's professional dedication. Detective Chen's insights helped me understand that Tommy and Father's behavior wasn't uniquely evil, but representative of broader predatory patterns that could be recognized, documented, and prosecuted when victims had appropriate resources. His work investigating cold cases had uncovered connections between my family's crimes and other unsolved disappearances across multiple states. While definitive proof remained elusive in most cases, pattern recognition helped families achieve closure and prevented other potential victims from suffering similar fates. Mrs. Henderson and I maintained regular correspondence until her death in 1967. Her letters filled with Cedar Falls news and updates on ongoing investigations into missing persons cases reopened following convictions. Her final letter, dictated when arthritis made writing impossible, contained advice I treasured. "You turned pain into power, child, and that's the most beautiful thing an old woman ever witnessed. Courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway." I was working night shift at Philadelphia General Hospital in 1969, 15 years after the trial that changed everything when the letter arrived. Hospital mail service had forwarded it through several addresses, tracking down my current location, despite my efforts maintaining privacy about the past. The return address showed Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution at Graterford Sender, listed as Patrick M. Connolly, inmate, 47293. For a moment, I considered disposing of it unopened. I'd built a new life, as Ruth Elizabeth Manning, my chosen name, honoring both original identity and the psychiatrist who'd helped me heal. I was head nurse in emergency department, married to Raymond Chen, who'd become more than just professional colleague, mother to 2 daughters we'd named Sarah Elizabeth and Grace Margaret, honoring women who'd shaped my understanding of courage and sacrifice. They would grow up knowing their worth, understanding their right to safety, learning that strength came from protecting others. But curiosity overcame caution. I opened the letter in hospital break room during meal period, surrounded by familiar sounds of medical equipment and urgent voices that had become soundtrack of my adult life. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered penmanship of man whose hands had aged badly in prison. But words were coherent, even articulate, in desperate attempt at achieving redemption before death. "Ruth, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I'm dying, and there are things you need to know. Cancer has spread too far for treatment. Prison doctor says maybe 6 weeks left. I've had time to think about what we did, about choices I made, about damage I caused. Tommy died 4 years ago in knife fight over gambling debts. He never showed remorse, never acknowledged we were wrong. Right up until end, he blamed you for destroying family, said you should have accepted your place and kept quiet. But I've had longer to think to understand what kind of men we really were. I've read books, talked to counselors, tried making sense of hatred that drove us to such terrible acts. I can't undo what we did, can't bring back Sarah, or give you back your innocence. But I can tell you truth about something that might matter. You're not my daughter, Ruth. Sarah never told you because she was protecting you, but Patrick Connolly wasn't your father. She was already pregnant when she married me, pregnant by a man named James Morrison, who died in mill accident before you were born. She needed husband, and I needed housekeeper, so we made arrangement that seemed practical. I raised you as my own for 22 years, but there was never blood between us. Maybe that doesn't matter after everything that happened. But I thought you should know you don't carry any of my poison in your veins. Your real father was good man, by all accounts, gentle, hard-working, devoted to your mother until he died." The revelation struck like lightning, illuminating connections I'd never considered. James Morrison. I read that name 3 times before implications registered fully. "I'm not asking forgiveness." The letter continued. "I don't deserve it, and you're too smart to waste it on dying fool. But I wanted you to know that when you escaped our house, you escaped from more than just immediate danger. You escaped from any genetic connection to evil Tommy and I represented. Raymond found me in break room hour, later tears streaming down my face as I clutched those pages. He read the letter without speaking, then pulled me into his arms with gentle strength that had first made me trust him enough to share my story. "Does this change anything?" I asked, thinking of our daughters of family we'd built together. "Only for the better," he said simply. "Now I understand even more clearly why you're such an extraordinary person." The final paragraph of Patrick's letter provided one more piece of the puzzle. "Your mother left another letter for you hidden where I never thought to look until after you'd already gotten justice. It's taped inside cover of that old Bible she kept on nightstand, the one with cracked leather binding. I asked my lawyer to retrieve it from property office and forward it along with this confession." The Bible arrived 3 days later, its familiar weight carrying me back to childhood memories of Mother reading aloud on Sunday afternoons. The letter was exactly where he'd indicated, written in Mother's careful script on paper, yellowed with age. "My dearest Ruth, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've discovered truth about your parentage. I pray you're safe, that you've escaped violence that poisoned this house since day I brought you here, as Patrick's supposed daughter. Your real father was James Morrison, and he loved us both with devotion that still takes my breath away. He died in accident at mill before you were born, crushed by machinery that should have been replaced years earlier, but wasn't because owners were cutting costs for profit. I was alone, pregnant, desperate when Patrick offered to marry me and claim you as his child. I thought I was protecting you by giving you father's name and place in world. I didn't understand then what kind of man Patrick really was, didn't recognize signs of violence that would eventually consume everything good in our lives. You are James Morrison's daughter, carrying his gentleness, his integrity, his capacity for love. Whatever darkness you've witnessed, whatever violence has touched your life, remember it comes from them, not from you. You have power to choose different path, to build life based on kindness instead of cruelty. I love you more than words can express. Be strong, be brave, and know you deserve all happiness this world can offer." I sat in our living room that evening, holding letters from 2 dead men, one begging acknowledgement of crimes, the other offering love from beyond grave, and felt final pieces of my identity click into place. The weight I'd carried for years, fear that somehow Tommy and Patrick's evil might be encoded in my blood, lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. Detective Chen, now my husband Raymond, had helped me research James Morrison's death during our courtship. It had been one of several suspicious accidents at the mill during wartime production pressures, possibly involving negligent safety practices that were never properly investigated. In helping me find truth about my biological father, Raymond had also uncovered evidence of industrial negligence that led to posthumous justice for James Morrison and compensation for other affected families. Our connection hadn't been cosmic coincidence, but professional dedication, intersecting with personal quest for truth and justice. Raymond's work on cold cases, his commitment to investigating unsolved deaths, had naturally led him to the Morrison file when he learned my story. We'd found each other not through blood relation or supernatural intervention, but through shared values and mutual respect for law enforcement's highest ideals. The revelation of my true parentage connected dots I'd never realized existed, but not through melodramatic coincidence. Instead, it illustrated how dedication to justice creates networks of connection that transcend individual cases or personal relationships. Raymond's investigation into industrial safety violations had uncovered a pattern of negligent deaths at Morrison's mill spanning decades. James Morrison's death in 1932 was part of systematic cost-cutting that prioritized profits over worker safety, leading to multiple fatalities that were covered up through inadequate investigations and falsified reports. When Raymond learned about my connection to James Morrison, he'd reopened the entire case file, ultimately exposing corruption that reached into county government and corporate boardrooms. Several executives faced criminal charges for conspiracy and negligent homicide, while affected families received long overdue compensation. Your father's death wasn't accident, Raymond explained during one of our early conversations. It was preventable workplace homicide covered up by people who valued money more than human life. But because you survived, because you found strength to seek justice for yourself, and Sarah James Morrison finally got justice too. This understanding transformed my perspective on seemingly random events into recognition of how individual acts of courage create expanding circles of justice that touch lives across generations. Our daughters grew up knowing this full story, not just the darkness their mother had survived, but the light she'd chosen to create from that darkness. They learned that families are defined by love and choice rather than genetics. That strength comes from protecting others rather than dominating them, and that every person has power to choose justice over convenience. Sarah Elizabeth, now 12, had announced her intention to become a police detective like her father. Grace Margaret, 10 years old, wanted to be a nurse like her mother. But more importantly, both understood that their identities would be shaped by their own choices and values, rather than predetermined by family history. We never visited Cedar Falls. The town no longer existed as anything more than highway exit, but we maintained connections with people like Mrs. Henderson's family, continuing correspondence that had begun during that terrible autumn of 1954. The house on Maple Ridge Road had been demolished and its foundation filled with concrete, but the site had eventually become a small memorial park dedicated to domestic violence victims. A simple plaque listed names of known victims, including Sarah Connolly, and provided information about resources for anyone experiencing similar situations. Patrick Connolly died 6 weeks after sending his final letter alone in prison infirmary. I felt no satisfaction at his death, no sense of victory or closure. He'd simply become irrelevant to story that had moved far beyond him into something constructive and healing. Tommy had died earlier, as Patrick's letter indicated his life ending in violence that mirrored the violence he'd created. Neither man had found redemption, but their destruction had prevented untold future victims from suffering similar fates. The real resolution came gradually through years of working with domestic violence survivors, through watching our daughters grow into confident young women, through building relationships based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. Every woman who found courage to report abuse, every child who grew up understanding their right to safety, every family that chose love over control, these were the true victories that transformed personal tragedy into lasting social change. I kept both letters from Patrick and Mother, filing them with other documents from that terrible time, but I never read them again. They'd served their purpose, providing closure for questions I'd carried and connections that enriched rather than complicated my understanding of identity and purpose. The most profound realization was that survival itself wasn't enough. Healing required transforming pain into power that protected and empowered others facing similar darkness. Every emergency room patient I treated, every student nurse I mentored, every domestic violence survivor Raymond helped find justice. These connections created networks of support that made individual tragedies serve collective healing. On quiet evenings, when our daughters asked about the past, I told them stories about their grandmother Sarah, who prepared weapons for granddaughter she'd never meet. About Mrs. Henderson, who faced killers with nothing but courage and shotgun. About James Morrison, whose love for my mother echoed through generations he never lived to see. These were stories that mattered, not darkness that tried to destroy us, but light that refused to be extinguished. Not evil that sought to perpetuate itself, but good that chose to multiply through acts of conscience and courage. That transformation, ongoing and imperfect as it continues to be, remains the most beautiful revenge imaginable, understanding that love is always stronger than hate, that truth eventually conquers deception, and that every act of justice makes the next one easier for someone else to achieve. As I write these final words, 25 years after that terrible October night, I am surrounded by family we chose, rather than inherited colleagues who've become friends, and work that transforms daily tragedies into opportunities for healing and justice. The girl who climbed into that bathtub believing in safety and family protection was destroyed completely. But from her ashes rose a woman who understood that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from empowering them, that real family is created through love and choice rather than genetics and obligation, and that survival becomes meaningful only when it serves justice for others who haven't yet found their own voices. This is my story not of victimhood overcome, but of power discovered, developed, and dedicated to ensuring that what happened to me and Sarah Connolly becomes impossible for future generations to experience. The darkness tried to claim me, but I chose to become light instead. And that choice renewed daily through every life I touch, and every injustice I help expose, remains the most powerful weapon against evil that any survivor can wield.